You point out the Bureau of Labor Statistics study on unemployment for people in their 20s. People with an associate degree today have a 2.1% unemployment rate. People with a college degree have a 15.3% unemployment rate. And people with a master's degree have an 8.4% unemployment rate. Stunning. Just stunning.
I did not know that. Just to repeat what Willie said, if you have an associate degree, you're basically fully employed. And if you have an advanced degree, you have a hard time finding employment.
This spring's senior class, the highest unemployment level for jobs out of undergrad this spring, getting jobs in June, are for students with degrees in mathematics and computer science. That is AI right there.
Prominent CEOs, leading economists, iconic investors. Insights from the experts. The Walker Webcast with Willy Walker. See who's next.
Welcome to my 22nd Walker Webcast with my friend Peter Linneman. Hi, Peter. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. 22. Wow. I knew we'd done, but it's been a pleasure.
It has indeed. And we have so much to cover in this hour. This quarterly Linneman Letter is as good as ever. It has some new data in it and some new analyses that I thought were insightful, yet in some instances didn't give me the conclusions that I was hoping for, and I want to dive into that. But Peter, before we jump into our typical discussion, you and I were both at the late Sam Zell's conference in Chicago a couple weeks ago with about 75 of the top investors and owners of commercial real estate, and you hosted a fantastic roundtable discussion. What was your general takeaway from that? We've met for 2 days, but it was really a day's worth of contact. What was your takeaway from people's comments?
So I'd give three. One was a lot of uncertainty still out there, but the fog may be clearing a bit. Some of the fog is economic, some of it is policy, some of it is when does capital market comes back. But I'd say there's still a sense of uncertainty, but there might be a little clearing of the fog. That would be one. Second, and you knew this probably better than anyone there, the banks are coming back. And the tenor that 6 months ago, the tenor was banks looking to run their books down, has switched to build their books up. And their problem is now, if somebody pays me off, I not only got to place that loan, but I've got to get a new loan as well. And that was a sea change over, say, a previous. And that was a general tenor, and equity will come as that debt comes. The third was the difficulty of development to make sense. And I think we all knew that, but what I found very interesting is at one point we were in a conversation and the main participants carrying forward the conversation on developing were like the Dell operation, the Lefrak operation, the Ofer operation, Pritzker operation, Gates operation, really high wealth, long-term, not looking to flip. I don't need to time it. Neil Bloom, I don't need to time it. I've got a good piece of land. If I'm a year early, I'm a year early. Who knows what 2 years? And that, I'm not saying no one else was developing, but that was the tenor, that if you have that kind of capacity and you could be right or wrong by a year and weather it, I found very interesting.
I would add, Peter, a fourth point from my perspective, which was just office. We sat in that room a year ago, and all of the big office owners were basically hiding under their seats, hoping you wouldn't call on them to tell you how bad the market was and the fact that there was literally no financing bid out there for their assets. And as you and I both saw, one after the other, most particularly with assets in Manhattan Class A assets, but there was a lot of, I don't want to say crowing going on because nobody was sort of, acting that way, but they were a dramatic shift in their outlook as it relates to leasing rates, financing opportunities, and sales opportunities for Class A office in Manhattan.
And I threw in one other. The office stock is shrinking. Yes, there's development going on, but we heard of, some conversions to resi, but some just being torn down and more suburban in that regard, just being torn down, and a new plan will come in there, whether it's resi or retail or whatever. So I think you're right. That made a tremendous amount of progress in a year.
Start a legacy. Start turning dreams into realities. A better world begins with you. Better communities start with us.
The one other thing I would add on that is I interviewed Owen Thomas out here in Denver at the last ULI conference. I guess it was late May, early June. And in that, we were talking about back to office, and you and I will get to this in our discussion today. But one of the things that Owen said was, you got to remember that economic growth, GDP growth, companies expanding and taking more office space is wildly more important to the office market than back to office and whether we get to 60% participation rates or 75% participation rates, et cetera, et cetera. And so I do think that the underlying economic backdrop, which you and I are just about to dive into, is far more important than back to office policies that obviously are taking up a lot of discussion time. And I want to dive into that a little bit later.
Just one thing, I think you're 100% right, and I think Owen's 100% right. One of the interesting things is, the multifamily data better than anybody. To the surprise of a lot of people, DC has been one of the best performing resi markets over the last year, both in single and multi, after it kind of froze on the election, right? It kind of froze on the election. My interpretation, and by the way, the Bay Area also showing good strength. I'm not saying out of the ballpark. My interpretation, Willie, is people got hired, let's just say with DC, you graduated from university, you got hired by the government, the FTC or somebody, in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. You didn't move there.
Right.
You didn't move there. You stayed wherever you were at, whether it was...
You moved to Denver, Colorado. You moved to Denver, Colorado, where you love the out of doors and the space, and now you've had to move back to DC.
And suddenly Trump said, you got to come in. And they came in. And so even though the federal government has reduced its labor force since Trump came in office, they've reduced it, I think, 56,000. And you figure half of that's in DC, just for a ballpark, right? Even though that's down, DC was hot on resi because you had to actually move there to go to work.
Which I'm going to take issue with your projections on what the good multifamily markets are in 27, specifically on that issue. But one of the other things that you point out in the letter is that DC office occupancy is up 600 basis points since June of last year, 600 basis points. And so while it's still in the mid to low 50s, which isn't like the Texas markets, which are all in the mid 60s, it has moved from the high 40s into the low 50s because of this change. And so it's not insignificant for office, and it's also not insignificant for multi.
Think about it. If I'm there to work with the government, not for the government, but with the government, and they aren't there, why am I there? But if they're there, I'd rather be in front of them if I can be, because in face will do a better impact. So yeah, absolutely. And in fact, you may remember, you kind of called me on it, but I said DC would be a surprise. Remember that about 3 sessions ago? So far,
you're right.
I'm right, even though they're losing employment, right? And that's the wild card of it. They're losing federal employment.
Well, they're losing federal employment, but then you pass the BBB and you sit there and say, okay, there's still a ton of government spending that's going on, and the Accentures and the all the other firms that work with the federal government are just sitting there saying, add people, they're going to cut down on staff in the federal government if they need people and resources to work on this stuff, so they're going to increase their contracting. I did see that somebody proactively, it was Oracle. Oracle proactively today in the Wall Street Journal says that they're cutting their billing rates to the federal government. I think Larry Ellison and Oracle are being very smart to sit there and say, we're going to cut our rates and we're going to do more.
I'll give you one other, and we just had the most recent data came out just after Linneman Letter went to press, but as of a month ago, the federal government had gotten rid of, I'm doing from memory, 48,000 workers since January, and state and local governments had added 49,000 workers. So government as a whole. Well, then last month's employment data that came out a week ago, last month's employment data is that it was about 147,000 job growth, of which half, about 74,000, was government. And federal was down 7. State and local governments are hiring like hell. And whether it's giving the middle finger to the Trumps, whether it's they have pent up needs, I don't know. But state and local are hiring quite dramatically.
So there are a couple of things that you say at the top of the letter, which I'm going to try and jump through only because I want to get you to dive in on my final point. But you say, first of all, to some degree, ignore the noise. That there's a lot of noise coming out of DC. Don't pay attention to it because we know that at the end of the day, the U.S. economy is going to continue to grow. I do put a little bit of a question mark on that, Peter, in the sense that Porsche and Daimler-Benz both came out yesterday and today talking about their quarterly sales volumes being down close to 10%. And I sit there and I say to myself, it's great to kind of not listen to the noise, but as it relates to tariffs and trade policy, that's hitting those two automobile manufacturers very significantly right now. And so I understand your point about the bluster and all that coming out of DC, but there's some very significant economic realities that are hitting the top line and the bottom line of some major companies as it relates to overall trade policy.
The second sentence of the Daimler Porsche, due to Japanese sales drop. Excuse me, China. Chinese sales.
100%. China and Europe were down. U.S. was fine. So I hear you on that.
Japan. I meant China.
Yeah, no.
That was, to me, in a way, that was more interesting than the down, that it was basically all China.
But you've got to think that the Chinese who are in a trade war with the U.S., you're an owner of a Chinese company that is exported to the United States and these tariffs come on and you say, maybe now is not the time for me to go buy that Porsche or that Mercedes-Benz. So the point being is, yes, it's that market that's brought it down, but it's clearly a derivative effect of what's going on with the United States.
Yes, but it also underscores it's a derivative effect, right? There's a lot of margins for adjustment effect, so that in first order, you would think it'd be massive. It's less massive than you think because there's a lot of back doors, right? Take the extreme, Russia, all these sanctions that are put on Russia, right? Endless numbers of sanctions put on Russia over the last years. And yet their economy kind of still goes forward because there's a lot of back doors. And I don't mean back doors even in an untoward way. There's just a lot of margins for adjustment. Now, you would then correctly say, yeah, but they've been hurt. And that's absolutely true. But those are with extraordinary,
right?
Like we're not going to do business sort of with kind of phenomenon.
So you didn't have issues with the BBB as it relates to basically sort of borrowing from tomorrow for today, yet you underscore your consistent comment about profligate spending in the wrong place rather than the right place. I get that. You say that the CBO estimate on the $2.4 trillion cost to the BBP is probably exaggerated by $1 trillion because they don't take into account any of the growth that you think comes from the tax cuts. You are not concerned about Q1 GDP being down slightly because your case is that producers were stockpiling prior to tariffs, and therefore that was why GDP stepped down. And then to get to my question, you talk about tariffs going from 3% to 20% if the president gets his 20% across the board. You think that's about 200 basis points of GDP growth. Obviously, very significant hit to GDP. And yet you and I spoke, maybe when we were in Chicago, maybe it was before that, Peter, where I asked you, how valuable is $65 a barrel oil to GDP? So in context of the 200 basis points that you think come out of GDP if the tariffs move forward, talk for a moment about the offset of $65 oil, because even without peace in Ukraine, and I do believe that oil was down in the 65 level because of the thought that we would come to some type of ceasefire and resolution to that conflict, and therefore Russian oil would start flowing again. That has clearly not happened. But as of yesterday, we're at $67 a barrel because the United States of America is pumping out close to 14 million barrels a day of oil today, which is the most oil ever produced by any country in the history of mankind. So talk for a moment about that offset of $65 a barrel, if it stays there, to your loss of GDP due to tariffs.
So just on the tariff loss, we're not going to lose as much as he originally came out with. We're going to lose. I think it's going to go from about an average tariff of about $3 per $100 actually imported to maybe $5. And that's detrimental. It could be $6. So that's harmful. But it's not going to be $20. It appears. Okay, that's one. The oil is interesting. There's a chart I've done in Linneman Letter for years, which is the real price of oil. And the current price of oil is almost exactly the average real price of oil. That is adjusted for inflation of the last 70 years, right? And so the most interesting thing to me is we have a war that's keeping Russia restrained, whatever you want to call it. We just had a bombing of the, sixth largest producer of petroleum in the world in Iran, and oil shot all the way up to $78 or $80 and then retrenched. Didn't go to 110, didn't go to 120, didn't go to 150. Why? You said it. The U.S. and fracking has recreated that world. And there's one other, and the Wall Street finally got it the other day, Guyana. And you've heard me mention Guyana a couple of times. Guyana is a dirt poor place, and they've got a lot of oil. And if you're a dirt poor place, you start pumping that oil. And when you look at Guyana's output increase from zero, basically 2 years ago, to something like 600 million barrels today, they're just beginning, because the only way they enter, quote, our world is pump like mad. And they're not part of OPEC. It's true. So the oil world has changed. Doesn't mean prices can't go up. They could even go to 80 or 90. But I think the world of going, by the way, in 20 years ago, if we'd have bombed Iran, where would oil have gone? It would have gone to 150, right? Without a doubt.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
And that tells you the power of oil. It's still volatile, but it tells you the power of fracking in the U.S. You now have the largest producer is a relatively stable place, and it's a place where we're a net exporter instead of a net importer. Huge change in the game. Huge change in the game for the U.S. and the world.
So if you think that a tariff rate goes from 3% to 5%, not 20%, you're going to take about 50 basis points off of GDP growth in that step up. So what does $65 a barrel oil add to the GDP number? And then net, where do you think GDP growth is?
Knock 20 of it off, 20 bips of it off, or 50, 80 bips of it off. It's a powerful, powerful force. Because
but it doesn't knock it off, it adds it. You're saying it adds.
That's right. It knocks off the negative. It reduces the negative. Right.
Yeah, I got it.
And what people, Willie, one of the funny things, and I don't think people realize this, when they release the CPI numbers or the PCE numbers, and it'll say exclusive of food and oil. It's not truly exclusive of oil. Why? It's
oil and everything.
Oil, but it's not exclusive of the fact that you and I are using oil right now.
Right.
Right. In like lots of things we're doing. I'm not saying they should, they're not lying, but it shows how ubiquitous it is all I'm saying. So its footprint, if you will, its multiplier, it's probably one of the largest the only multiplier that I could imagine being bigger than oil and gas, if you will, is probably human capital, right? Is the only bigger multiplier. If we're healthier and there's more of us, it's a huge multiplier.
So I wasn't going to go to this now. I had this much later on, but since you just raised CPI, let's dive down that rabbit hole for 2 seconds. The latest print without owner equivalent rent in it is 1.5%. And you and I have spent plenty of time, and anyone who's new to the Walker Webcast and wants to hear Peter and me go endlessly into why owner equivalent rent shouldn't be part of the CPI calculation, go back and look at Walker Linneman number 13, 18, 17, as many as you want to look at.
Or read it.
With owner equivalent out, you're at 1.5, and annualized April to May was 0.8%. And so you're basically, and then one of the other things that they have in there, Peter, which you pointed out in the letter, was that they have rents. Owner equivalent rent is something nobody pays. People clearly pay rent. People clearly pay rent, but their rent calculation says that between August of 23 and May of 25, rents in America were up 8%. And you actually put forward in the letter that if anyone listening to this who owns apartments was able to get 8% rent growth between August of 23 and May of 25, call you, because you'll send them a soda can or something. But
and by the way, my phone has been silent.
Crickets. So my point is, as it goes to that, then if you think that CPI is at 1.5, okay, and you basically think that the short rate should then be about 225 to 250, and you think the 10-year then should be somewhere around 375 to 450. And
350 to 4.
Oh, I like that. We like the auditor on that. But
step back from the inflation just a second. From about 1983 or so until the onset of the recovery from COVID, what had inflation been? And inflation had been 1.5% to 2.5% with a little volatility, and over time getting closer to 1.5% to 2%. Okay? And then we had supply chain issues and monetary expansion issues. Okay? And you could argue which did it. I believe it's the supply issues, but you could believe it's the money supply. It doesn't matter. They both spike at the same time. Okay. What's happened to the supply chain issues? By the New York Fed's index, the supply chain issues are gone, completely gone for a year and a half now. And by the Fed's data on monetary creation, they've only increased the money supply by like 2% over the last year. So the sources of inflation, which are either money creation or supply chain issues, are long gone. You're back down to where you were. And is it surprising you're back down to where you were when the world starts looking like the world we had from 84 to 2019? And the Fed, I mean this jokingly, but they are committed to not letting inflation come back. And reminds me of like a Vin Diesel movie where the number 3 bad guy, right, gets horrible person, and somebody victim of his shoots him, and they reload and shoot him, and the Vin Diesel character finally comes up and taps him on the shoulder and says, "I think they're dead. You can stop." You know that scene?
Yeah.
We need somebody to come tap the Fed on the shoulder and say, "I think they're dead."
Well, I mean, look, the President of the United States is tapping him on the shoulder, and the President of the United States is threatening to put in a phantom, nominate the new Fed chair so that so basically Jerome Powell loses his power. But
he's not wrong about everything.
Look,
he's not.
Hold it. Hang on a second. The President of the United States today, someone wrote me this the other day, said, might be the most powerful individual we have seen in our lifetime. President Trump is on a complete roll right now. Whether you like it or whether you hate it, he is on a roll. He is getting what he wants, and he is leading. And you may not like where he's leading us, and you may love where he's leading us. But the bottom line is we have someone in the Oval Office today who is very clearly leading. But back to rates. Your prediction, and it was a year ago on this call. Where you made a prediction on how many Fed rate cuts we were going to get, and I said there is absolutely no way we're going to get there, and you were right, and I was wrong. But your current prediction is we're going to get 100 basis points out of the Fed funds rate between now and the end of the year. You want to?
Everybody thinks I'm crazy at this point when I'm saying that.
100%.
Just as crazy as they thought I was a year ago.
Most banks have 2 at best right now.
Right.
And so and whether we get it, and that was one of the other things that you and I debated last year, whether I would give you credit for 2 rate cuts and the 50 basis point cut that they did in September. It didn't matter. You still won the bet. But by the way, so you're going to go with 100 points. I will take the under on that. I don't think they'll get to 100. So here's the question. I don't really want to kiss your feet again. I think you wear New Balance, and I like On. So you want to make a bet? I'm on the under on less than 100. You say 100, and I owe you a pair of New Balance in January of next year if they got 100, and you owe me a pair of Ons in high skies. Great.
Sounds
Great.
good.
We're on it.
Sounds good.
So,
and the only problem is now the winner has to pay a tax on it since it's public.
yeah, well, I think your New Balance, I think they're made in America, and
they are.
Yeah,
at least they claim to be. Right.
Exactly. Talking about inflation is actually a good place to talk on one thing as it relates to construction, because you did mention at the top of the call about how challenging it is to make construction numbers work right now. And I will say, in the multifamily space, one of the most exciting things for people who own assets in multifamily is that for all of the forward look that says it is going to be an undersupplied market, and there was a real page number that came out this week, Peter, with absorption in Q2 that made my jaw drop. We have seen an unprecedented amount of absorption in the multifamily market over the last year with unprecedented deliveries due to the fact that single family is so thoroughly unaffordable that no one's moving out of multi into single. But all these developers in the multi-space are looking at the cost of development and all of the issues as it relates to labor, as it costs to the cost of cement, things of that nature. And to your point, they're holding back on building, which for owners of asset is putting forth a very, very attractive scenario for rent bumps in 26 and 27 and 28. But as it relates to inflationary pressure, you point out that lumber costs are way down. You point out that gypsum and cement costs are still at all-time highs. Why is it that we have seen gypsum and cement stay so high while all the other input costs have come, not crashing down, but have at least reverted back to their normal trends?
I don't totally have the answer. If I had to give an answer, it's a little more in the weeds than I think it's because there is a lot of construction occurring.
Yeah.
And data centers, government building that's going, what is Build Back America, whatever it was called, the infrastructure bill, right? There is a lot of construction still going on. So if you look at the aggregate construction, there still is a lot of construction going on. And that's keeping those elements up.
One other thing on that, gypsum is also used in agriculture, and the agricultural industry is pulling a lot of the gypsum from the construction industry or the parts that go into it. And then also we do import, I believe, 22% of our cement from Canada and Mexico. And so because of all the things that are going on from a trade policy standpoint, those supplies into the U.S. have also had some issues as it relates to pricing those imports.
But wait, just one. There's one of the things I think is an interesting chart in Linneman Letter, is we have that index of materials kind of cost, right, over a long period of time. Turner also does, right?
Yeah.
It basically rises over the long term about 1% above inflation, right? And that's because of the labor component. The materials part basically tracks inflation over a long term because it's an adjustable item, right? You extract a bit more, you make a bit more, there's lags and there's demand surges. And I think that's what people have to remind themselves, is that if anything has a reversion to the mean, it tends to be the inputs other than labor in construction. Yeah.
You and I have talked about this a little bit in the past, but there's a stat in the letter that's talking about GDP going from 26 trillion pre-COVID to 30 trillion today. Yeah. And then you give a GDP per capita number, which says that it's gone from $81,000 per U.S. citizen to $89,000 over that period of time. My question, and you see that and you say, wow, that's quite something, $8,000 of additional GDP per capita. And you say, wow, that's great. Everyone's kind of benefiting from that. My question to you is this: are there the top 1% of the U.S. population, and not even the top 1% of the U.S. population, like the top million people who benefited from that growth in GDP, and the other 360 million people are sitting there watching that number go, but it doesn't come back to them?
That's the meme headline, if you will. It's just not true. If you delve into the data, it's actually been the lower earners who have done better better in a percentage sense over that period. Obviously, they haven't done as well in absolute dollars. 10% of 300,000 is different than 10% of 50,000. But in a percentage growth, it's actually been the lower. And by the way, that shouldn't surprise you, because if you go back to when a lot of that occurred, it occurred when we had huge labor shortages for every kind of labor. We didn't have a shortage so much of entrepreneurs. We had a shortage there for a couple of years of just just normal people, right? They have benefited. And then you go down one level, not down. You then say, well, what about retirees, right? Well, they're pretty insulated, right? Because Social Security is indexed. And to the extent their 401k types, their 401ks have done quite well over that period if they had a kind of normal 401k, right?
Right.
And so they've done well. So obviously, has someone making $500,000 done better when they got a 9% increase than somebody earning $50,000 getting an 11% increase? In absolute dollars, of course, but it has not been the stereotype that it's all gone to the top. It just is not true. And by the way, on wealth, the wealth variant, that's the income variant. The wealth variant is pretty simple. The wealth variant is if you were 23 years old and you had no wealth, you're now 26 years old and you still have no wealth. That's no surprise. You've not changed, right? If you had no wealth, your wealth hasn't grown a lot over that time period. However, and yes, the Bezoses and such have had enormous wealth increase. But if you look at the society at large, what's the main driver of the wealth increase? It's two things. It's been stock market is rebounded, and that's the 401ks for people, which is not spendable for most in the meantime, but it's part of their wealth. And the other is their home value.
Housing.
Their home value. And by the way, the home value is up for a this. Somebody who had a $180,000 home 5 years ago, so it's a low price home, that's now a $215,000 home. And somebody who had a $400,000. So again, it's been across the board. The dollar gain is more, but it's actually been across the spectrum. It's been across the spectrum.
So I want to dive in on a couple of things in there, and I want to try and make it so you and I can get through all this, because there's so much in there that I want your perspective on. You do a comparison of pre-COVID to where we are today in prices and growth on all sorts of different things, real GDP, everything out there. And what's interesting about it is that most of the things you track have sort of high single-digit, low double-digit growth between pre-COVID and today. There are three outliers. There's almost nothing in 20%, there's almost nothing in 30%, and then you get into 40% and it's at high 40s and low 50s. There are only three of them, and they are median home price being up 58%, right, multifamily starts being down 47%, yep, and office vacancy being up 48%. Okay.
So let's take the first two. Do you think they're related?
Yeah, of course.
The fact that home prices are up so dramatically.
Careful what you point out, because I'm going to bring some data to you in a second that doesn't make any sense on what multifamily markets you think are going well. But anyway, hang on a second. So on that though, because this gets back to the consumer, okay? So you then go on to talk about this, that you talk about the delevering of the U.S. household makes it so that as prices in single-family homes have gone up 58%, the relation to disposable personal income has gone down 11%. In other words, you have a stat in there that talks about the median average price to disposable U.S. income is down 11%, even though prices have gone up 58%.
Yep.
Talk about how that can be.
Well, asset appreciation, income appreciation, it's that simple, right? It's that simple. I mean, I went to Catholic school in a working class town, and we learned how to do ratios. And it's both the numerator and the denominator, right?
Clearly, they didn't
that
teach us that.
simple.
Clearly, they didn't teach us that at the vocational school that I went to, but it's all good.
Yeah, there's schools, I suspect, in Boston that didn't teach that. They only focused on the numerator or the denominator. We focused on both.
But so here it is. So one of the stat is that total household debt as a percentage of disposable personal income stood at 87.9% in Q4 of 19. Okay, let me repeat that. So household debt as a percentage of personal disposable income stood at 88% at the end of 2019, and today it is at 76%. 76%. That is down 12 percentage points.
Right.
Over
And where's that from? By the way, the thing that makes the headline is not what you just said. The thing that makes the headline is what? It got to a low of when there was nothing to buy. Literally, there was nothing to buy in 2020. You couldn't go out, you couldn't go to the ball game, couldn't travel. It got down to what, like 50%, something like that. And what got the headline is it's jumped up. Not that it's still below. Why is it still below? I'm doing this number off the top of my head. You may know the actual number off the top of your head. It's something like 37% of all American households have a mortgage at 3% or less. Now, when you compare that to, say, 2019 or any other, quote, normal year, you wouldn't have had that. You would think of the savings of just 2 percentage points. That's 2 percentage points of saving for that population. 2 percentage points of savings on a mortgage that's 80% of the value of your home. That's a lot of spare money. And then you go, I'm doing this from memory, Willie, but isn't it, it's like 17% or between 3 and 3.5% mortgage. And then there's another 12 between 3.5 and 4. So you have something like 60% of the population 60% of homeowners have a mortgage less than any historical norm by at least 150 to 300 basis points. That's why the ratio is down.
Which is why I have issue with your home renovation index. So you state in the letter, which is great data, that the home renovation index is a great leading indicator of home sales.
Right.
Because everyone goes and they go out to Home Depot and they buy all these supplies and they come home and they repaint the deck and they clean up the bathroom because they're going to sell their home. And so you're basically saying in your home renovation index, get ready because home sales are going to come up because everyone's going to Home Depot and buying all this stuff. And I read that and I say, no way. They're fixing up their house because they're not going to sell it and they want to make it nicer because they're going to stay in the house.
And I think that's a kind of inflection point. I think you're right. It's not an either or. It's a both. Obviously, there is a both. And it was always a both, but it was more the former, namely fixing it up to get ready to sell. And I think you're right that it's probably more, I'm not going to sell. And I'm going to live here for 4 more years. And can I add a room? Can I fix up the basement? Not to sell, but to live for 3 or 4 more years than I thought I was going to live. And I think you're dead on that. And you're right that therefore the robustness of that as a leading indicator is it's certainly skewed because we know this mortgage part. And by the way, Willie, we were the first people I ever heard talk about this locked in low mortgage rate thing. No one was talking about that 2 years ago. 3 years ago, we were talking about it. And it's a huge impact. It's a huge impact. And the shortage of housing is a huge, and it's not going to go away. The shortage of single family is not going to go away in a hurry.
The one thing that you remember I said at our meeting in Chicago was just the Trump administration using go zones as well as trying to take BLM land. They may try and circumnavigate the NIMBYism that exists at the local level and just do some land grants to build affordable housing and single family housing. I think
one of the things, by the way, I had never thought of that. I think it's a very good possible insight. And it's one of the reasons I like hanging around with you and other smart people is they not only can tweak at the edges, they can actually point out something you hadn't thought about. And I think you're very old military, whatever, right? They could change the whole tenor of things.
Because they wouldn't give it to the county or the state and say, you all go through your typical entitlement process. They'd say, we're doing this. I mean,
and it would end up in court. We know it would end up in court.
Yeah. Right.
And I'm not illegal enough to know, but I thought it was a brilliant.
I did see the manufactured housing owner operators who have basically built incredible businesses due to NIMBYism, that the tracts of land that they have for manufactured housing have been basically a scarce commodity because of local governments giving a lack of permitting for new affordable manufactured housing communities.
And it is, and by the way, Willie, it's even one step further. One of the reasons those manufactured communities are so attractive is it's impossible to build affordable homes.
Right.
Right. And if you could build affordable homes, the manufactured housing would still be viable, but it'd be a little less. The other thing, Willie, about the shortage of single family housing that's been built over the last 14 years, that doesn't affect Musk and Bezos, and it probably doesn't affect most of the people listening because that's not the price point of home you're buying. But when we've underproduced for 14 years single family housing, the secondhand market, if you will, for homes, there's all those homes that normally would have been built in those 14 years and somebody would be buying secondhand, so to speak, as a used home, they don't exist. And the squeeze comes on people who would be buying, I'm calling them secondhand homes, but you know what I'm referring to. They would have probably been the second owner, maybe the third owner. They don't exist. They didn't, a lot of them just didn't get built. That is squeezing a particular group of people. And they're the ones who are renting single family. They're the ones who are staying in multi longer. And I don't see that changing very rapidly. Absent something dramatic like you're describing, right, where there's a game changer around the state and local. Because the state and locals, let's be honest, they've talked that they want affordable housing. They've talked they want affordable housing. The truth is, they really don't.
Yeah.
If they did, they would be all. If they want more affordable housing, I'll tell anybody listening how to do it. Just have the same governance standards that Houston has. It's that simple.
No, Houston and LA are the two perfect examples. You and I have talked about this before. Houston has done an incredible job of eradicating its homelessness issue, and LA has only exacerbated it. And you can take it all back to land entitlement and the fact that in Houston you can build anything anywhere, and in LA you can build nothing anywhere.
Yeah, and by the way, one has Houston's greatest asset, without a doubt, is affordable housing.
Yeah,
and it is. You know, it's not like Houston's in a gorgeous location. It's a nice place, but it's not like it's gorgeous. It's not like it, unless you like 100% humidity all the time. And so, but it has one amazing asset, and that is affordable housing for employers, for people. They can live, they can do. And all you have to do is copy their playbook. All you have to do is copy their playbook.
As we talk about Houston and manufactured housing, I have to take a quick pause here, Peter. I had not planned on doing this, but I just do want to make a point of the catastrophic flooding that took place in Texas this past weekend. It touched so many people, and it has touched us at Walker and Dunlop very personally as an incredible person on our team, Matt Pohl, lost his 8-year-old daughter Abby in the flooding that went through Camp Mystic, and it has been an exceedingly challenging time for everybody as it relates to the loss of life and particularly to the loss of all the young girls who were at Camp Mystic. And I've talked to Matt, as you can imagine, a number of times since the tragedy struck on Friday. But I will tell you, it's a disaster, and it's a tragedy that hits so deeply, and it's so sad.
Yeah.
And so anyway, to Matt and to his family, and to those listening to the webcast this week, which goes far and wide, our sympathies and our condolences obviously go out to those who lost loved ones in those tragic floods.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Peter, I want to mention 2 other reports you get to, and then I want to dive into job growth and markets, because I've teased up that I'm going to kind of go after you on your prediction as it relates to good multi-markets based off of job growth and office occupancy. But you did mention 2 things that I just want to point out because I think they're really important. One, you point out the Bureau of Labor Statistics study on unemployment for people in their 20s. And you point to the point that people with an associate degree today have a 2.1% unemployment rate. People with a college degree have a 15.3% unemployment rate. And people with a master's degree have an 8.4% unemployment rate. Stunning. Just stunning.
I did not know that. I mean, I didn't know that. And in fact, you can imagine, I was reading that, you start reading a study, you think you know what it's going to say. And you then read what it says, and you go back and say, well, and just to repeat what Willy said, if you have an associate degree, you're basically fully employed. You have a job. And if you have an advanced degree, you have a hard time finding employment.
And 2 other pieces on that. This spring's senior class, the highest unemployment level for jobs out of undergrad this spring, getting jobs in June, are for students with degrees in mathematics and computer science. I'm willing to bet. That is AI right there.
But I'm willing to bet that there's a category that's harder to get employed, and that's if your major was studies, if the word studies was in it. I don't know that. I was saying to a friend this morning who adores you, that I'm like a jilted lover as I approach these universities, in that I love what they did. I love what they're capable of doing. They changed my life. And then I see their failings, and I'm like a jilted lover, that it just tears me up. But when you see that you go and you get more training, and you're less employable. And yes, you can say AI is part of it, but that's not all of the number we're talking about. Right. And shame on the universities for not advising students there may not be a job at the end of the rainbow. I've seen that happen. It's very unfortunate. But
this next data
I was stunned by that, Willy.
I was
That's
too.
The only
and
reason I put it in.
This next data point only underscores that, Peter, and that is that you pull up this New York Fed study, which talks about 10 million borrowers are likely to see a reduction in their credit scores due to failure to pay their student loans, and that 43% of those federal student loans are not making payments today. 43% are not making.
That one I got right. You may remember.
100%.
I thought, remember the question, legitimate question was, when the grace period ended, the COVID grace period ended, all these students would be squeezed, all the former students that are paying. And I said, no, I just think you're going to just see mass not paying, and they're going to gut out the political system. Now, the problem they face is, whereas I think the Biden administration, if they would have, done this, would have worked with them. I think the Trump administration, again, right or wrong, doesn't matter. They're going to say, look, You took it on. You co-signed, dear parent.
Right.
You know, something like 89% or 92% of the federal are co-signed by parents, and you're the one who got an advanced degree in how to start a revolution or whatever, right? And they don't have a lot of sympathy.
No, they don't have any sympathy, but your point is the derivative effect here. Just keep in mind, 10 million students who took out loans who potentially by the Fed study are going to have their credit scores downgraded. And by the way, I don't know whether you noticed this morning, but FHFA just approved for this competitor to FICO to be able to give credit scores that are accepted by Fannie and Freddie just yesterday.
Yeah, I saw that.
Really interesting, really interesting. But staying on topic here, 10 million students could have their credit scores downgraded. If they're trying to rent an apartment, if they're trying to go buy a home, get a credit card, that's going to have an impact. But the other derivative effect is mom and dad who are on as signatories. When the Trump administration goes from, Judy or Johnny didn't pay back their student loans, they're going to go to Peter and Mary, who are the parents, and that is going to have an impact on that next generation. So
assuming they can collect.
Right.
The government has been a miserable debt collector, even when they want to. There was this famous issue, if I say the wrong pitcher, but David Cohn was a well-known pitcher for the Yankees and Mets and so forth. And there was a time where, who was Proxmire, I think? Senator Proxmire was this golden fleece kind of thing. And the government was saying they couldn't find these kids who owed them. And a pitcher for the New York Mets was on, and they say, he owes you. You can find where he's at. And so whether they will collect as opposed to say, right?
Yeah.
I'll tell you who I think suffers the most. If it's not going to be apartments, it's not going to be, it's going to be DoorDash and Uber.
Yeah.
And, Willie, you're old enough. I'm really old. But kids who aren't making that much use DoorDash. I'm not trying to use, I'm using them in the way of people might say Kleenex, the delivery service.
That's an example. Right.
The delivery service, they use delivery service and cars in a way that I've never seen. So my wife and I live in Center City, Philadelphia, and we mostly carry out food. And so here's this sweet little 74-year-old couple every night trundles out. If it's raining, we still trundle out. If it's snowing, we still trundle. And we pick up our food 3 or 4 blocks away. The young people in our building, they're just having delivered left and right.
Yeah, they're saying, hey, use this thing.
Exactly.
But Peter, that does just one quick data point on that is really interesting because you pointed out Americans spend more today on dining out than groceries.
Yeah.
That is a huge stat to keep in mind. Everyone's talking about the fact that like Walmart and Amazon are doing really well because they're selling a lot of groceries, but the trend is and obviously the store that's preparing your food still needs to go and buy those groceries either from Walmart, Amazon, or some other wholesale distributor. So I'm not trying to say that that's big pressure on their business, but I thought that data point was fascinating that people spend more on.
It's even more dramatic than the data I show. You say, why? If you say what's being sold in the grocery stores, it's not just cans of beans. It's increasingly pre-prepared food.
Big time.
To be taken out. So if you kind of put that in as dining out, if you will, it's kind of in a middle zone. It's even more dramatic as opposed to we're sitting here at home preparing.
All right. So I want to dive to job growth post-COVID and why on earth you pick the multifamily markets that you pick, given the data I'm about to give you. So top job growth cities, job losses in the pandemic and what they've recovered since then, okay? So the top of the list there is Salt Lake City at 218%, Raleigh, North Carolina at 229%, Austin, Texas at 224%, Dallas, Texas at 207%, and Phoenix, Arizona at 199%, okay? All at the top of the list, all have done an incredible way of attracting jobs. And oh, by the way, that Dallas, Texas 207 number, they'd added something like 420,000 jobs in Dallas. It's stunning, okay? And then on your laggards, this isn't going to surprise anyone. You have Los Angeles, California at 94%. They're not even back to 100% of the jobs they lost, okay? 94%. Boston, Massachusetts, 93%. San Jose, California, 90%. Minneapolis, Minnesota, 99%, okay? Point out here, this is a political statement based on fact, not personal belief. Look at those states that are red states and look at those states that are blue states. Look at those cities in red states and look at those cities in blue states and what they have gotten from job growth post-pandemic. And you cannot sit there and say that the companies and the employees want to be in those red cities, in those red states. It's just numbers. It's just math, okay?
It's just numbers.
Just point that out. So how can your multifamily projections for the hot markets in 2027, not even 25, 27, you're going out 2 years from here, okay? Your weak markets are Charlotte, Raleigh, and Austin, 3 of which I just talked about having over 200% job growth post-pandemic.
Okay.
And your strongest markets are New York City at just recovering their jobs, Orange County just recovering their jobs, San Jose only at 90%, Detroit just recovering their jobs, and Chicago just recovering their jobs. In other words, you picked out, and obviously supply and demand, I know you're going to tell me the Sunbelt markets have tons of supply, and therefore they've got a glut of supply to get through, and these other markets haven't had new supply brought on, and therefore you've got a tighter market. They're still growing jobs just a little bit, but we're going to go with the supply and demand on apartments rather than on the job growth. And I sit there and I say to myself, but if you're going to own, you're not owning for Q4 2027. You're owning for Q1 29 and Q1 32.
But be fair, I only projected out to 27, right? I mean, no, but you hit it. You really hit it in that it is supply and demand. And there's no doubt Houston, Dallas, Phoenix, it's Vegas. These are demand growing, Orlando. These are demand growing places. But there's a lot more supply than there was 20 years ago. A lot more supply than 20. If they added no more supply than they had 20 years ago, those markets would be out of sight in terms of rent. Can you imagine?
No.
What would happen? I mean, it would be stunning, right? But they add supply. And so all we're saying is, in spite of large growth, some of these markets are so restrictive on growth, right, that you're going to have a tight market, and by the way, Detroit's a very localized special case because there's not much supply. I bet you could go to your book of business at Walker Dunlap and you'd struggle to find anything being added to the supply notable in multifamily.
We're selling a portfolio in Detroit right now, and the list of bidders is out the door, because there's no new supply. And if you have good inventory there, you're gonna see rents.
People are going to live in Detroit, right?
100%.
So there's no supply. The people are going to live there. There's going to be a little population growth. There's going to be some job growth and no new supply growth, and there'll be some income growth. So that's how I'm taking Detroit, which people might say is the hardest. In an odd way, it's the easiest because the supply is the lowest. And if I have no supply growth, and you might even have shrinkage because some stuff is being torn down, you can get rents go up even though you have very little growth, right? And you can have a lot of growth. By the way, there was a man named Alfred Marshall, right, in like 1912. And until that point, the economic theorists there was a group of them who described prices being determined by supply. And there was another group that were just saying, no, prices are determined by demand. And Alfred Marshall's famous contribution is, no, it's the interaction of supply and demand. That's still true. And it's not perfect, but it's still true.
But I got to go to this. I got to go to the real page data that came out earlier this week, Peter. You had 227,000 units absorbed in Q2 of 2025. In the last year, we've had 800,000 units absorbed, 800,000 units. This is unprecedented as it relates to the demand for multifamily units. So if we thought that that demand was going to go away because single-family housing starts were up precipitously and we were going to get a lot of new supply that people could move from their apartment building into a single-family home, I'd sit there and say, okay, these oversupplied markets are going to have a longer time to get through this inventory and therefore not be able to push rents. But what we're seeing right now, that the other thing that was interesting in that RealPage study is that landlords today aren't pushing rents. They're going for occupancy, which I think is interesting. Right. So national occupancy right now is at almost 96%. It's at 95.6%. So even as we're at levels where landlords could push rents, they aren't pushing rents. Please, someone send that news flash to local politicians who are trying to put rent control in across the country, because they're doing what's right for their assets for the long term and not trying to price gouge at this point.
And they can't push so much because there's enough buildings still in lease up to stabilization.
That is correct. And that's why in a market like Austin, you still can't push rents because you want to get to that. That's exactly right. But
because there's a new building, I'm going to one in Philadelphia this afternoon we're involved in. Beautiful building, and it's leasing up, but we're like 82%, and we're in lease up, and there are buildings that are at 95, but they can't push because we're only at 82, right? Not just us. There's a handful of buildings like us, and that's disciplining it. In fact, I think what's going to surprise people about multifamily, you ask questions and you answer them. I'm going to ask myself a question and answer. I think the surprise for multifamily is concessions are going to burn off faster than people think. It's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah.
And, there are a lot of markets with month, 2 months concessions on free rent, right? And one of the things that has happened, and I don't have data on this, I wish I did, is as demand keeps growing and supply drops, you get back up to normal. First thing to go are all those concessions.
Yeah.
And you have a month or 2 months of concessions, that's like 8 to 15% income increase, right? And that can happen in a matter of not weeks, but in a matter of months. A market can go because, our building, the one I was just talking about, gets to 94%. What's keeping the concessions in place suddenly anymore, right? And you can get that market. I think that's going to flip faster in multifamily than people are prepared for. I think there's going to be some pleasant surprises because I think people are underwriting it as a slow phenomena, and I think it'll be a much faster phenomenon.
I'm going to go try and figure out how you and I can come up with something that shows whether you're either right or wrong on those strong and weak markets 2 years from now, and we can have a look back on it.
There you go.
Because we're almost out of time, and then I have a final question after this one. But so right now, the Linneman Real Estate Index, which, as you're very clear in the letter, points out that it's an extremely good predictor of cap rates. You have the LREI increasing by 500 basis points over the next 2 years, which would take it from 147 to 152. What does that translate into as it relates to cap rates?
We only do industrial and multifamily because when you get to office, it's hard to know what a cap rate is because of long leases and so forth. That'll be 50 to 100 basis points in pricing. And by the way, I've said this, you've heard me say it, and if overnight 50% more money showed up to buy the same assets, cap rates are going to go down. Now, I'm not saying 50. If you get 5% more money overnight showing up to bid for the same number of assets, the price has to move. It just does. Cap rates have to move. And we saw it in reverse. When money went to the side, the index is down for like the last 2 years. And it says money doesn't want to be there. And when money doesn't want to be there, the building is still lovely, the location is still lovely, the rent roll is still lovely, but if the money doesn't want to be there, you don't get the pricing. And I think you're going to go, and you're on the edge of seeing all of it. Transaction volumes starting to creep up, right? You're no longer at record low transaction volumes. You're not at normal transaction volumes yet, but you're what? They're in multifamily and industrial, normal transaction volumes are at least foreseeable. Is that a fair way of saying it? That if there's momentum, you could get there?
Yeah, I obviously have to be careful between now and our earnings call as it relates to talking about those issues, but we have been public about saying that we are seeing transaction volumes pick up significantly in multifamily.
It's just data, and I don't know yours, but and the reason capital's coming, we're back to what we were saying where we started. Capital comes off the bench, it wants to find a home, and people are good at finding homes for money. One of the interesting things, if you give people a lot of money, they'll find a home for it.
That is for sure. I will tell you, it's interesting on the LREI and your comment about saying that you only do it for industrial and multi. I spent a week before last in London. We've opened up the office there, and I met with all the big private equity firms and all the big investors. And the only two asset classes that anyone wanted to talk about were industrial and multi. Period. End of statement. There was not a conversation about retail. There was not a conversation about office. There was not. It was industrial and it was multifamily, and then data centers. And the one other thing I would say on that, Peter, is I had coffee yesterday with the CEO of a pretty large data center company, and we're sitting there talking about W&D entering the space, and I said, a lot of these deals have been done by banks and single asset securitization deals and this and that, but we're seeing the opportunity for us to come in and work on a lot of different deals. And I said, these are big checks of, $2 and $3 and $4 billion. And the CEO, Peter, across his cup of coffee goes, Willy, we're closing a financing next week with a syndicate of banks that is a $32 billion financing.
Wow. So but to that, one of the questions I raised to one of the speakers at the event we were at, who was talking very, very bullish about and accurately about the data center, is, and I'm doing this from memory, a 60% development margin, a 60% not lever, 60% development. Real estate historically is a 15 to 20% gross margin business. And you show me any business where you can get 3 to 4 times the traditional margin, it's going to get overbuilt. And I don't know how fast it's going to get overbuilt. But those margins, by the way, not just real estate, right? You show me any business where suddenly you can get 3 to 4 times the typical margin, money is going to flow there to try to arbitrage that away. And it's not going to do it in a week, and it's not going to do it in 2 years. But 60% development margins? My God. Yes, you need a lot of capital, but there's a lot of capital, as you're just saying, there's a lot of capital out there for something with a 60% margin. But by the way, there'll be a lot of money out there for something with a 30% margin still, and a lot of money and until it gets down to a 15 to 20% margin.
2 things on that, and then I'm going to give a final reminder of people of what you said in January on exactly this topic. First is Nvidia's market cap got over $4 trillion this morning.
I know.
Which is unbelievable. Nvidia runs 80% margins, which runs circles around Google, which runs 60% margins. So to your point, you need to have a monopoly on what you are selling, and there is no monopoly in the data center space right now. You need to have a monopoly on what you sell, like Nvidia's chips and Google search engine, to be able to run margins like that. Yeah. And then the final thing I will say is to remind people of your quote from our meeting in January, where I said to you, tell me what is the stay rich asset class? You said multifamily. I said to you, what is the get rich multifamily asset class? You said office, which right now is looking exactly right. And oh, by the way, the comments in Chicago of a couple weeks ago were not there when you said that in January.
That's correct.
That's right. And then the final thing was, what about the get poor? And you said data centers. So as I sit around with somebody who's saying I'm raising $32 billion, and I say, if Walker & Dunlop could only participate in that financing, we'd make a lot of money on it. There's plenty of money to be made, but I think in the long term, there's also probably plenty of money to be made.
And to be fair to the speaker, who was very bullish, they said, we don't know what the exit is. We do believe there'll be a lot of building. We just think a lot of the building will be dumb, and we think we have good assets. And that's a micro real estate discussion, right? That's a very different discussion.
Well, that's back to the Bobby Taubman, David Simon comment a couple of years ago, where I think it was Bobby who said there are 1,000 big box malls in America, and we need about 250 of them. And then somebody else pointed out that David Simon owns 249 of the 250. Peter, I could keep on going all day. We've run over. I've loved it as always. Thank you, my friend. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And we will obviously be back next quarter with another Linneman discussion. And we will also be back next week with another Walker Webcast. Thanks, everyone.
Tell your friends to join and watch this. Always a pleasure, Willie. Thank you.
Take care, Peter.
Bye-bye.
Bye.